My name's Amy Marjoram Berg, and I'm an Executive Vice President here at the Aspen Institute, and we want to welcome you to the last of our Hurst lecture series of the summer season. I want to thank Soledad and Bob Hurst for underwriting this lecture series, which allows us to bring people from all over the world here to Aspen to talk about their views. And we really appreciate all of you coming tonight. This has been a really terrific series. It allows us to bring people in at the last minute when we find out that they're in the area. And Senator Ron Johnson, we heard, was in Denver. And so he drove up today over the beautiful Independence Pass to speak to all of us here in Aspen, and we really appreciate it. Senator Johnson is from Wisconsin. He serves on several Senate committees, very powerful Senate committees, including Budget, Commerce, Science and Transportation, Foreign Relations, Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, and Small Business and Entrepreneurship. And in fact, it's that last area, business and entrepreneurship, which he really brings to the Senate, given his experience in the private sector, building his own business, working for businesses, and looking at the world more from that perspective. So we're very thrilled to have you here tonight and to give us your views on what's going on in the Capitol and in the world and what you think about it. So thank you so much. And
thank you, Amy.
We'll have time for questions at the end.
Well, thank you, Amy. And by the way, Independence Pass is absolutely gorgeous. I mean, that was a real surprise. Thank you for coming. I truly do appreciate it. I'm hoping I don't totally ruin your night. I've got a unique ability of taking a group of smiling faces and turning them into frowns because the information I'm going to present is not particularly fun to look at, but it's something I think we have to face. But before I get into that, let me start just a couple table stake statements. In terms of the solution to so many of our problems, it really is strong and robust economic growth. And conceptually, what we need to do in this country, I think, is pretty simple. You have to make America an attractive place for business risk-taking, business investment, business expansion, job creation. How do you do that? Well, I think you really do have to take a look at the things you got going for us. And we're the world's largest market. We have relatively inexpensive energy. That's a competitive advantage. We have pretty bad tax code, pretty disincentivizing, not competitive globally, and our regulatory burden is onerous. So the components we have to work on, I think, are pretty common sense. Politically, it's been pretty difficult to address them, but we're not going to address them until we go through a problem-solving process. My background is educationally in accounting, but I ran a manufacturing plant, produced plastic sheet for medical device packaging, printing applications, exported about 20% of our sales overseas. So I've also been involved in international sales. As a manufacturer, it just kind of gets built into your DNA, how to solve problems and going to root cause analysis. But we've all seen a 12-step problem-solving process, right? I mean, what's the first step in those processes? It's generally admitting you have a problem. Unfortunately, as human beings, so often we have to hit rock bottom before we finally make that admission that we got the problem so we can start addressing it. And then I would argue the next step, maybe it's the same step, is you have to properly define it. If you don't admit you have a problem, if you haven't properly defined it, you're not going to solve it. Your solutions are going to be misdirected. Now, coming from a business background, I've done a lot of negotiating. And I didn't start negotiations getting in the argument right away, covering all the areas of disagreement. Instead, I would spend a lot of time on the front end of any negotiation, really ferreting out all the areas of agreement. The benefit to that is, first of all, you develop a relationship with the person you're negotiating with, and then you also develop a level of trust. So when you get to those areas of disagreement, it's a whole lot easier finding common ground. Now, I take that exact same problem-solving approach, that exact same negotiating approach to my new role as the United States Senator trying to grapple with these enormous problems. So tonight, I'm hoping we've got a pretty broad spectrum of political opinion here. That's great. And let's start out with an area of agreement. Because I truly believe, I don't care where you fall on the political spectrum, we all share the same goals. we all want a prosperous America. We really do. We care about each other. We all want every American to have the opportunity to build a good life for themselves or family. Now, I will be the first to admit there's a wide diversity of opinion in terms of how you create that prosperity, how those opportunities can really be provided. But as we start going into these enormous problems this nation faces, both fiscally and culturally, I think it's important that we don't question each other's motives. I don't question people on the other side of the aisle. I hope people don't question mine. We really do care about each other, and I think that's just true. Now, the first chart I ever did as a United States Senator was this one. Again, root cause analysis. I'll throw it out my theory right off the bat. I'll be upfront with you. I think the root cause, certainly of our fiscal situation in this country, and I would argue, and you'll see slides at the very end of the presentation, a lot of the cultural problems literally is the size, the scope, all the rules, all the regulations, all of the federal government's intrusion into our lives, the resulting cost and debt in government. And this is a chart that gives you the metric. You know, if you believe as I do that this is a problem, you got to manage this metric. And very few people realize that only 100 years ago, you know, I got white hair, I used to think 100 years ago was a long time period. It's not. But only 100 years ago, the federal government was 2% of our economy. In other words, 2 cents of every dollar our economy produced was consumed by the federal government. Back then, state and local governments were 5%. So 100 years ago, the total take of government across the board in the United States was 7%. Now, I would argue that was the vision of our founding fathers. A limited federal government, and what government we had was close to the governed. You know, anybody here involved in local government, school board, city managers, I think you'd agree with me that local government's pretty accountable. You know, pretty under control. If you're a school board member and you are proposing a property tax increase, you can be pretty well assured that in a room probably like this, the citizens of your locality are going to be at a meeting demanding that you spend that money wisely and efficiently. Now, you move government to a state capital like Madison, Wisconsin. It becomes a little less accountable, a little less under control, but states, at least, by and large, are under the constraint or restraint of a balanced budget amendment. They can't spend more than they're taking in over time. You remove government to the alternate universe, the city in which I now serve, Washington, D.C., and government becomes pretty unaccountable, pretty much out of control, which is why our nation's debt now exceeds $17.4 trillion, which is a figure that is larger than our economy and really is mortgaging our kids' future, threatening future prosperity. So here's the history of governmental growth. You can see the spikes in World War I and World War II. When I entered the Senate, because of the stimulus and other government programs, the spending was about 25% of our economy. In other words, a quarter of everything the economy produced, we were spending at the federal level. Now, it's been a messy process. I would argue because of the 2010 election, a bunch of fiscal conservatives got elected. We've restrained the growth of government. Now it's at 20%, but over the next 20-some years, it's on a trajectory again to hit 30%. If you tack on state and local governments, we're already at 35%, on a trajectory to hit 45%. Now, I don't think it's theory or conjecture when government consumes, a nation state consumes that much of an economy. Government is a horrible allocator of capital. The private sector is not perfect, but it allocates capital economically. Political system allocates capital politically. They don't do a good job. Those nation states that have tried have failed. Where's the Soviet Union today? I know Vladimir Putin's trying to reconstitute it, but it failed. Venezuela, oil-rich nation. It's an economic basket case after Hugo Chavez's failed socialist experiment. And anybody here ever vacation in the island paradise of Cuba? Castro hasn't exactly worked. And you know, we all saw a couple years ago the riots in the streets in Greece as their social welfare model began to fail because they hit a debt crisis because they couldn't afford it anymore. Now, I don't know why anybody would want to put America on this path, but this is the path we're on. And I would argue we really need to get off this path because it's unsustainable. It's not going to be good for our kids' future. Now, I'm happy to admit I'm a fiscal conservative. As a result, I get accused of all kinds of mean, nasty, ugly things. So some of my charts and graphs here are really meant to dispel myths. Now, for example, I get accused of wanting to impose draconian cuts on the federal government or put America on an austere spending path. Well, let's just look at the facts, the figures. 10 years ago, the federal government spent $2.3 trillion. The The last couple of years, again, we've kind of restrained the growth of government. It's been flat. We spent about $3.5 trillion. Now, the argument moving forward is the House budget proposes spending $5 trillion 10 years in the future. President Obama, Senate Democrats want to spend $5.9 trillion. So you don't have to be an accountant or an economist to look at this chart and realize that in total, nobody is proposing cutting the federal government spending. All we're trying to do is reduce the rate of growth in spending so we don't hit a debt crisis, so we don't have a real calamity on our hands here. Another way of looking at this is spending over 10 years. 2 decades ago, over a decade, the federal government spent $18 trillion. Last 10 years, $32 trillion. And again, the argument moving forward is the House wants to spend $43 trillion over the next 10 years. President Obama, Senate Democrats want to spend $49 trillion. Again, in total, no cuts, just reducing the rate of growth. Now, if you've ever heard the term $6 trillion draconian cuts, that's what people are talking about, the difference between spending $43 and $49 trillion. Again, that's Washington speak, where a reduction in the rate of growth in spending is termed a cut to scare people. Here's a big part of the problem. So much of our federal budget is on automatic pilots, mandatory spending. In the 60s, 68% of the federal budget was appropriated. That's that discretionary spending you hear people argue about. And you had 32% mandatory spending. Back then, it was primarily Social Security and also interest on the debt. Over the decades now, we've basically reversed that. Last year, only 35% of the budget, about $1 trillion out of a $3.5 trillion budget, was discretionary. It was actually appropriated. Unfortunately, with the continuing resolution, there's no prioritization of spending, a pretty messy process. And you had 65% mandatory and automatic pilot. Now it's Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, food stamps, all the entitlement programs, and interest on the debt. If we don't reverse course, if we don't start limiting the growth in federal government spending, in 10 years, only 23% will be discretionary. You have 77% mandatory. Now, I come from the private sector. If I ran my business's budget this way, where basically 65 to 77% of its budget, spend whatever it takes, healthcare spending, sky's the limit, retirement, whatever it takes. My business would be bankrupt. It'd be employing 0 people. If you did this on a personal basis, you'd be in front of a bankruptcy judge in no time. So this doesn't work. We've got to get control over spending. Now, I realize when we shifted from hundreds of billions of dollars to trillions, it's incomprehensible how much $1 trillion is. And so this chart is really trying to personalize our debt and deficit. If you take our $17.4 trillion divided by 318 million people, you realize every American's share of the federal debt exceeds $55,000. $55,000. Now, 10 years in the future, that'll be about $75,000. I actually give this little PowerPoint presentation in colleges, universities, and when we're talking to young people, I really tell them to concentrate on that $75,000 number 10 years in the future. And then because you're young, you better tack on $150,000 for your parents' share and $150,000 for your grandparents' share, because that debt's not going away. You're going to bear that burden, your kids and grandkids. You realize what we're doing to our kids? I don't know a parent or parents that will willingly drive up their personal debt, max out their credit card, never intending to pay it off, but fully intending to pass it on their kids and grandkids. Now, we don't do that on a personal basis, yet that's exactly what we're doing collectively. And until we admit we have that problem, until we feel a little collective guilt, we're really not ready to start solving the problems. And this is a problem that has to be solved. Now, remember I mentioned Greece earlier? Whoa, wrong one. On this metric, you'd actually be better off being a citizen of Greece because their share of their federal debt is where about we were in 2009. We've blown by Greece in just the last 5 years. Again, this is unsustainable. We've got to start solving the problem. I want to spend a little time on Social Security. Now, I got in trouble during my campaign because before I ever decided to run for the United States Senate, I gave a little speech and I called Social Security a Ponzi scheme, and that's not entirely accurate. So let me correct the record. A Ponzi scheme is illegal. When the federal government runs a Ponzi scheme, it's legal. So Social Security is a legal Ponzi scheme. I take no pleasure in saying that. It's sad, it's unfortunate. The federal government, politicians of both parties, this is a bipartisan problem, utterly mismanaged Social Security. They spent the money. It is gone. It doesn't exist. What they put in its place are U.S. government bonds. But the problem with the U.S. government bond in the hands of the federal government is it has no value. It's the same thing as if you had $20, spent it, again, that money's spent and it's long gone. take out a piece of paper, write $20 on it, stuff it in your pocket, and go, hey, I got 20 bucks. No, you don't. You have a piece of paper that you're going to have to take out of your pocket, present to somebody else, and hopefully that person will give you $20 in exchange for your promissory note. So it has no value. But here's what's going to happen to Social Security over the next 30 years. And by the way, we'll talk about this, but that's the relevant period we got to be concentrating on, 30 years, the demographic bubble. Whether you look at the trustee number or Congressional Budget Office number, somewhere between $12.7 trillion and $14.6 trillion will be paid out in benefits more than we receive in the payroll tax. Now, by the way, these are some pretty solid projections. This is actuarial math. We know the demographics, we know life expectancy, we know the benefits promised. So this is going to happen. And again, the only way a politician can look the American people in the eye and lie to them, that this is solvent to the year 2033, I think they may back down and say it's 2031 now, is because of the fiction of the Social Security Trust Fund. But I'm not the only one calling it a fiction. The Office of Management and Budget, in its own publication, 2010, said the same thing. Yeah, you got a trust fund, it's got those bonds, they pay benefits, but only in a bookkeeping sense. Those bonds are not assets that can be drawn down to fund future benefits because the OMB recognizes, yeah, you got an asset in the trust fund worth $2.77 trillion, but they're U.S. government bonds. A U.S. government bond is a liability to the Treasury. You consolidate the books of the federal government, that transaction nets to zero. I've tried this 7 times in Budget Committee with Treasury Secretary Liu, OMB directors, CBO Director Elmendorf, Fed Chair Yellen. Only CBO Director Elmendorf and Fed Chair Yellen would admit that it nets to zero. The other 5 times, the administration officials refused to acknowledge what OMB's own publication states. Now, that's a real problem. When government officials continue, even though the words are right there, it's obvious they refuse to acknowledge the trust fund has no value. They're not admitting we have a problem. The trust fund does exist. That's a picture of it. And I'm not kidding. It's a 4-drawer file located in a federal building in West Virginia. This is what politicians are saying will support Social Security for the next 20 years. It just won't. We've all seen the debt charts, pretty interesting. We didn't really have debt until the 1950s, and it really took off in the 80s, 90s, in the last couple decades. And by the way, this is a bipartisan problem. I hear it all the time. You guys just got to learn to get along. You got to compromise. Listen, I'm willing to work with anybody who's willing to acknowledge the problem, work with me in good faith to solve it. But to steal a line from Tom Coburn, it's not like we haven't gotten along. We've gotten along all too well for decades, spending our kids' and grandkids' money. That process has got to stop. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the definition of the problem. One thing in Washington, D.C., everybody's focused on a 10-year budget window. That's how everything is scored. We got blinders on. It's just 10 years. It dramatically understates the problem. Our problem, the true definition of it, is the 30-year demographic bubble, the baby boom generation. They're retiring at the rate of 10,000 people per day. We've made all of these promises. We do not have the money to pay for them. And so the way to really look at this is the deficit over 30 years. And by the way, the government really doesn't publish that figure, not in an understandable format. I was part of the small group of Republican senators that was working at the White House trying to find common ground. I brought my problem-solving skills, my accounting skills, and I started talking about a 30-year budget. This is CBO's alternate fiscal scenario. I'll tell you what we came up with projection. I'll tell you both scenarios, but this is the one that as I look at CBO's assumptions, this is the path I think we're on. And you'll notice in the first decade, the CBO estimates would be $8.3 trillion. I don't know if that's sustainable. That's enormous. The problem is the second decade, it's $31 trillion. The third decade, it's $88 trillion for a whopping total over 30 years of $127 trillion. Now, again, it's incomprehensible. Let me put that number in perspective for you. The entire net private asset base of the United States, every asset held by every household, every business, large and small, is $106 trillion. Again, you don't have to be an accountant or economist to realize this is a huge problem. Now, CBO's baseline says $66 trillion. Our own projection was $101 trillion. And that's the projection I took in the White House. We had a 2-hour meeting with senior White House staff. President Obama joined the meeting for the second half. And when I got my chance to make my pitch, because President Obama, of course, wanted everything on the table. So, Mr. President, the way you get everything on the table is let's describe the problem in the American public so they'll be with us for the solutions. They'll be demanding solutions. And I was showing him that $101 trillion deficit over 30 years. He looked at me and said, Ron, we can't show the American public numbers that big. It'll scare them. They'll throw up their hands, give all hope. And he says, besides, Ron, we can't do all the work. We have to leave some work for future presidents and future Congresses. Now, that's a problem. That's a little disheartening for somebody who left the private sector, a life I love, to solve this problem, realizing I don't have somebody as a willing partner to even compromise with. Because if you're not willing to be honest with the American people, if administration officials aren't willing to be honest that the trust fund has no value, if the president won't go to the American public and show them the extent of the problem, I just don't know who I'm supposed to work with here. Now, if that graph doesn't scare you enough, this is the one that really keeps me awake at night. This is what we're trying to avoid. What I call this chart is the graphic depiction of a debt crisis. What it shows is from 1970 to 1999, the average interest rate the federal government paid on its debt was 5.3%. When we were a far more creditworthy nation, back then our debt to GDP ratio was somewhere between 40 and 67%. Now it's over 100%. By the way, it's a pretty reasonable interest rate, right? If you've got a mortgage, you're probably pretty close to that interest rate. For the last 4 years, so that the federal government doesn't feel the pain, experience the cost of its gross fiscal mismanagement, the Federal Reserve has been keeping interest rates artificially low at 1.5%. By the way, there's some real victims to that. If you're a senior on a fixed income, you got an annuity rolling over, maybe it's making 4, 5, 6%. Now where do you invest on a risk-free basis? You can't. If you're a young person, you're thinking, I better save for retirement. I want part of my portfolio in a risk-free asset. Where are you going to get the benefit of compound interest? And oh, by the way, these low interest rates are grossly misallocating capital as well. There's a reason the stock market is booming, because that's where the money's going. Now, what's a debt crisis? I mean, a debt crisis is really when the U.S. dollar ceases to be the world's reserve currency. And creditors around the world start looking at the United States and say to themselves, they're not getting their act together. They're not serious about solving their debt and deficit problem. They're credit risk. I'm not going to loan them any more money, certainly not at that rate. If we just return to that reasonable interest rate of 5.3%, that would add $650 billion per year to our interest payment. $650 billion, that's 65% of that discretionary spending amount I was talking about. It's more than we spend on defense per year. It's more than we spend on Medicare. That's not only a debt crisis, that's a political crisis, is that interest payment that would have to be paid starts crowding out all these other promises that people have gotten addicted to, okay? Now, that's the end of my budget charts. I've got 2 more sets of charts, and they're really designed to make people think. And they're really designed to, I guess, make my point that all this well-intentioned government, and by the way, it's a $3.5 trillion entity, all based on great intentions. But those great intentions have got very serious, very harmful, negative, unintended consequences, and I just want to get people to think about it. I give this, like I said, I give this speech at colleges, so I'd throw something up there that maybe young people might be concerned about, the cost of college. What this shows is that in the 60s, 1 year of college, that's room, board, and tuition, cost under $1,000. Now, had that cost just increased the rate of inflation, today, 1 year of college would cost a little bit more than $7,000, but instead, it costs over $17,000. The cost of 1 year in college has increased at 2.6 times the rate of inflation. Why? What is so different about what colleges and universities spend their money on that the cost would rise so much faster than inflation? By the way, 2 of those components, room and board, food and shelter, have actually risen across the rest of the economy at a lower rate than inflation because we've gotten so much more productive at providing shelter and producing food. So college costs have actually increased at more than 2.6 times the rate. So what's changed? What's different? Well, here's something that's changed. The federal government, with the best of intentions, because we all want to give kids the opportunity, they got involved. And of course, the federal government got involved the way it always gets involved. It starts pouring money into a program. And by the way, with the money, there's all kinds of strings attached, all kinds of mandates that also drive up the cost. So when you pour money, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of grants, we've enticed our children to incur $1.2 trillion collectively of student loan debt. What's sad about that is Northeastern University studies showed that 50% of recent college graduates are either unemployed or employed in a job that required no college education at all. I'm suspicious maybe because the universities are so awash with cash, they can actually offer degree programs, fill-in-the-blank studies, that I'm sorry, employers just aren't valuing. Today, recent college graduates have somewhere between a $25,000 and $29,000 average student loan debt, depending on whether it's a public or private university. We've done a huge disservice to our children by enticing them into that debt. And the federal government, with the best of intentions, have actually made college less accessible because we've made it so much more unaffordable. Again, just my theory, not saying you necessarily agree with me, I just want you to think about it. Let's talk about poverty. Because that's really what all these programs are intended to alleviate, right? And we didn't really start measuring poverty to the late 50s. But what you can see is early on, from the late 50s to the mid-60s, poverty was coming down pretty dramatically, from 39.5 million Americans in poverty to 29 million, from a poverty rate of 22.4% to 15%. You know, back in the 60s there, we had the black and white boob tube. America, for the first time, had images of abject poverty being beamed in the living room. And let's face it, we are a compassionate society. We all want a strong social safety net. The problem is, how do you design a social safety net that remains confined to the people that truly need it? Where that net doesn't continue to expand to people that take advantage of it, start abusing it, commit fraud, expand to people where it creates incentives and disincentives that are very harmful. Well, we haven't figured that out. It's a real conundrum. But still, we're America. We want to help people help themselves. We want to help people that can't help themselves. So we engage in what? A war on poverty. This is the low estimate. About $16 trillion is spent. I've seen recent estimates about $20 trillion. So we spent $16 to $20 trillion on a war on poverty. Now, I'm in Washington, D.C. I will guarantee you the federal government doesn't measure the intended results of all these good intentioned or well-intentioned programs. It doesn't even consider the negative unintended consequences, certainly doesn't measure them. Let's do just a little Monday morning quarterbacking on the war on poverty. Did it work? Number of people in poverty, 29 million to, we're at 46 million today. 47 million Americans are on food stamps. In the year 2000, 17 million Americans were on food stamps, and we were spending about $17 billion on it. Last year, we spent almost $80 billion on it, and 47 million Americans are on food stamps. In 2000, it was 6% of the population. And since the start of food stamps, it's really kind of cycled between 6 and 10% of the population, depending on economic conditions. The last 4 years, 15% of Americans are on food stamps. That is not a metric of success. It's a metric of failure. But I'll be the first to admit, it's not the best metric, number of people in poverty, because our population has increased. So a better metric really is poverty rate. So we started at 15% a couple of years after we engaged in the war on poverty and the spending spigot started. We're still at 15%. It's flatline. It's gone up and down with economic conditions, but it's 15%. There's no way anybody can objectively take a look at this, sadly, unfortunately, and say the war on poverty worked. It didn't. We didn't solve the problem. And I would argue all of our good intentions probably exacerbated it, made it worse. And this is why. First of all, little demographic information on poverty. You can see in the early 50s, the gold line is elderly poverty. The green line is youth poverty. You can see we had a real problem back in 1959, but you can see with elderly poverty, with all of the transfer programs, we've done a pretty good job at lowering that rate. I think we probably all say 9% still too high, but we've done a pretty good job. Haven't done such a good job with our young people. And I really want you noticing how those lines crossed in the 70s, shortly after the war on poverty began. What this really represents is a huge wealth transfer from young to old, and that problem is just going to be exacerbated over the coming years. Because who's going to pay off that debt? Who's going to pay off the deficits in Social Security and Medicare? It's going to be our young people. We need to understand that. let's kind of break down poverty. Again, average rate 15%. Now, what I'm going to talk about is something pretty sensitive. We're talking about poverty. I'm going to be talking about intact families versus single-parent families. It's not a value judgment on single-parent families. We all know people done a wonderful job raising great kids. This is about a discussion in the reality of poverty. Because if you have a two-parent household, the poverty rate's under the average, 6 to 9%. But if you're a single mom, and let's face it, it's a struggle. It just makes sense. Just one parent working, trying to take care of kids, poverty rates are significantly higher. Still 41% today. We have to recognize that reality. We have to face that truth. So now I'll talk about something that's really politically unpopular. Births to unwed mothers. Now, by the way, I'm not the only one concerned about this. I first heard about this from somebody called Daniel Patrick Moynihan. He was a social scientist at the time, became a Democrat senator from the state of New York. He was alarmed. He had seen out-of-wedlock birth rates go from 4% to 8% from the 40s to the mid-60s, and he started writing about it. By the way, he paid a pretty heavy price professionally for even bringing the subject up. So I'm not doing this for political popularity, trust me. I'm doing it because we have to take a look at this. Now, we saw that objectively the war on poverty didn't solve poverty. Let's keep our fingers crossed. Maybe, just maybe, all of our good intentions at least prevented this thing from rising. Not exactly. Today, 41% of births are to single moms. Now again, nothing wrong, nothing value judging about single parenting or single moms. But this is not a metric of success. This is not something we want in our society to continue to grow. It creates some real problems. And we've always done this for the kids, right? That's what all these well-intentioned programs are. Was that good for our kids? Now, let me just run you through a thought experiment on this. One of the first people I met on the campaign trail was a state senator from Wisconsin. He's actually running in a primary today for a congressional seat. At the time, his stump speech talked about a single mom, who again, we've got a great deal of compassion for. We want to help people like that. She's struggling to take care of herself and her young ones. She's working a part-time job, makes $15,000, real person. And then Senator Grothman totaled up the dollar value of all the state and federal government benefits she received. He came up with a figure combined with a salary of about $51,000. I had my Senate staff do the calculation. We came up about $47,000. Depends on your assumptions. Now, as an aside, I'll point out that's largely tax-free. In a larger, more depressing PowerPoint presentation, I would have shown that median household income has actually declined during the recovery from about $55,000 to $51,000. That's taxable income. Now, here's the thought experiment. If that young woman, who again, we've got a great deal of compassion for, we want to help her out. If she wants to increase the dollar value, the benefits she gets from state and federal governments, what's one of the things she can do? You can have another child out of wedlock. If she wants to lose it all, she finds a young man who can support her, she marries him, she forms one of those intact families that help alleviate poverty. We had a very interesting witness in front of our Senate Budget Committee. He was the head of the Welfare Department of Pennsylvania. And he had done a study on single moms. And what his study showed is that up to $29,000, it was marginally beneficial for her to make an extra dollar. In other words, she put more money in her pocket. Past that point, because of increasing tax rates, declining benefits, it didn't benefit her not even a penny to make an extra buck. In other words, it didn't benefit her to make $30,000 or $40,000 or $50,000 or $60,000 or $65,000. She would have had to leapfrog from $29,000 to $67,000 before she could put another penny in her pocket by working. Until we understand and face those types of truths, until we understand the negative, harmful, unintended consequences of our good intentions, until we understand the incentives and disincentives of all these well-intentioned programs, we're not going to be able to solve these problems. Again, is this good for our kids? It's not. So again, I'm not asking everybody to agree with me. All I'm asking people is to get the facts, get informed, and think. Now, if you want to get some more facts, I've actually got all this information, all these charts and graphs on my Senate website. You're happy to log in and try and get some of that information. With that, I'll open it up to questions. anything's fair game. It doesn't necessarily have to be about this. I'm on Senate Foreign Relations. I'm on Homeland Security, Budget, Commerce. So I've got a relatively broad portfolio of things I'm trying to figure out as it relates to the federal government. So I guess you just raise your hand and they've got a runner. Sir, you want to wait for the microphone? Then people can hear you. It's coming. Okay. If you want to, let's give it a shot. Here we go.
Seems to be part of our lives. Why hasn't that become wildly inflationary? Because we're printing money with nothing behind it, right?
Right.
Well,
There's two components to causing inflation: the quantity of money and the velocity of money. And listen, I'm not a huge Fed basher. I think what the Fed has been trying to do is manage through monetary policy gross fiscal mismanagement. I place the blame, the root cause is really an out-of-control federal government grossly mismanaging our fiscal situation. So I'm very sympathetic with what the Fed had to deal with after the housing collapse. They didn't want deflation, which would be actually more harmful. That's what the housing bubble was, right? When that burst, that was deflation in the housing. You saw how calamitous that was. So the Fed didn't want further deflation, so they had to pump up the quantity of money because the velocity of money had shrunk so dramatically. And that's what they've been trying to manage. Now, the danger is they pumped up the quantity. If the economy starts heating up, it's going to be very difficult to precisely manage the reduction of the quantity of money to accommodate the velocity. So it's a danger. Nobody knows. We've obviously seen the Weimar Republic. We've seen hyperinflation. I think we got better tools. I think we have greater knowledge of that. But I'm highly concerned about it. I think every American should be concerned about it. Okay? Ma'am. I guess right here.
There was a proposal 3-4 years ago, the Simpson-Bowles budget reduction proposal. There is a blueprint that's out there. We heard other people from Washington this summer talk about their own budget proposals. Why don't they just do something that two highly respected gentlemen put together, solve the problem? It's there.
Well,
there is a blueprint.
Am I glad you asked me that question? Do you realize we've done 81% of Simpson-Bowles? Simpson-Bowles, in terms of deficit reduction, was about $3.4 trillion. Now, they also had, part of that was some Social Security reforms, which we didn't do. But it's been messy. It's not the way I'd do it. But we've actually enacted about $2.8 trillion deficit. We had $700 billion tax, and by the way, it's been a balanced approach. $700 billion of tax increase in the fiscal cliff deal, about $2.1 trillion of spending restraint, again, just reducing the rate of growth in spending in the first debt ceiling agreement. So 2.8 versus 3.4 trillion. Now, the way Simpson-Bowles got to 4 or 5 trillion is then they took credit then for the reduction in interest expense because of reduced deficit. So again, 2.8 versus 3.4, that's 81%. So we've done an awful lot of Simpson-Bowles. It really hasn't moved the number. It's stabilized it a little bit. I mean, it's helped us bring down the deficit. It'd probably be higher than $680 billion last year, but we're still on a totally unsustainable chart. So Simpson-Bowles was not a panacea. I know it's politically popular because it was a Democrat working with a Republican, and I'm all for that. But I'm also all for a true evaluation, a true enumeration, a true definition of the problem. And Simpson-Bowles was just addressing a 10-year problem. And I'm hoping I was convincing that we've got a 30-year problem. Okay? I guess in the back there. Right here.
About a week ago, Republican governors were here, and Chris Christie bringing together 4 or 5 other governors, and they got applause over and over again, mostly for talking about programs in their states that were succeeding. Here's the problem. Here's what we're doing. Here are the numbers of the solution. I have to say, listening to the Senate for the last several years, I hear a lot of problems, and I don't hear a lot of solutions. So here's your chance. There's a Republican Senate after November. We have a Republican president, or at least somebody who wants to work with the Republican Senate and House. What policies should address these long-term issues?
Yeah. Well, again, I've kind of stated up front in the generalities, which is where you have to start. You have to target what are the priority issues, priority items you have to address. And from my standpoint, you have to have pro-growth tax reform. It's just critical. It's not companies' fault that they're following the incentives to actually move overseas or not invest in the United States. It's not their fault. It's a horrible tax code. So, I mean, first argument I try to make, the first piece of information is try and show the American people, try and convince them how counterproductive, what a self-inflicted wound the corporate tax is. It's not the piece of paper, the corporate charter, that pays the tax. It's the employees through lower wages, lower benefits, and consumers. The corporate tax is paid by us. That's crazy. My business was an LLC. All that income was attributed to me, and I paid individual income tax rates on it. How about coming up with a tax reform? By the way, corporate tax only raises 10% of our revenue. It's what all the lobbying's about. How about we figure out, and there's a number of ways of doing this, make the owners pay the tax on the business as opposed to employees and consumers. So I think tax reform, by the way, you can't reform our current tax codes. You got to get rid of it. And I would set up a brand new tax code, dramatically simple, with very simple principles. Raise the revenue you need to match spending. And then I would do no economic harm. Stop trying to socially and economically engineer through the tax code. We're not smart enough to do that. If you got rid of all the preferences, all the credits, all the deductions, had a very simple, relatively flat tax, can you imagine how growth incentivizing that would be? And again, growth is our number one component. You got to look at regulations. I mean, I talk to businesses, again, I was in the private sector. I understand the onerous nature of our regulatory regime. $1.8 trillion is what it costs to comply. Let me put that number in perspective. Only 10 economies in the world are larger than $1.8 trillion. So, a couple of proposals, the REINS Act. Allow Congress to disapprove, get rid of a regulation that exceeds $1 million, $100 million in compliance costs. That's kind of good governance. How about a one-in, one-out rule? But that's what the British do. If you as an agency want to issue a new regulation, you got to find an old regulation that costs as much to comply with and get rid of it. Personally, I'd offer a 1-in, 10-out rule because I think that's how many barnacles we put on the hull of our economy, and we need to scrape them off. So regulatory reform, tax reform, and then, by the way, I'm a manufacturer. If you want to make things, you need power. And just in general, that's a competitive advantage for America because we've got relatively cheap power. Let's not artificially drive up the cost of power. I don't want to compete labor rates with the rest of the world. Let's compete. We're the world's largest market. We got that going for you. As a manufacturer, you want to be close to your customers. So if we get our tax system competitive, our regulatory environment competitive, keep energy prices competitive, we're going to have robust economic growth because people want to consume, people want to produce, people want to innovate. It's just the government's really gotten in the way of it. So, I mean, that's, without getting specific, that's pretty much the direction of where you need to address the primary, the top priorities of what we should be doing in the Senate. But talking to the states, I'm not going to argue that the federal government's got to get out of the way. And what you just described is our federalist system, 50 different experiments where you've got government close to the governed. Why is it successful? Because it's close to the governed. It works better. It's more efficient. It's more effective. Let's start over time devolving back to the system of our founding, to that framework where we give states most of the governing power, and the federal government does a few things enumerated in the Constitution, the things we're supposed to do. Let's do a few things well rather than try to do everything very poorly. Okay? So to me, that's the solution. Let's devolve the power back to the states. But that's a long glide path. We got to deal with the government we've got right now, and we got to try and make it less harmful, create greater certainty for our economy. Right over here. Sure.
What are they working on? What more can they come up with to protect our borders? I'm thinking of, all the people coming in from Mexico, the young kids, they're still crossing our border. And with the threat of the ISIS terrorists coming into the United States, surely they must be working on some more solutions. So maybe you could update us on something like that.
Well, again, root cause analysis. Why do we have illegal immigration? Because we incentivize illegal immigration. We just do. We don't have a functioning guest worker program. So people want to work, and there's no way of doing it legally, or not if not a robust enough way to do it legally. So we have a bunch of illegal immigration because of that. The Senate Comprehensive Immigration Bill, which I voted against for a number of reasons, I thought it would exacerbate the problem because in that bill there are incentives. $260 billion of benefits for non-U.S. citizens. I think I proved that we can't afford the benefits to U.S. citizens, much less offering another $260 billion And you know what that is? That's an incentive for illegal immigration, as well as before we secure the border, it also offered a path to citizenship. And if you do that before you secure the border, that's an incentive. And the current situation, there was a problem with the 2008 trafficking law where we lengthened the adjudication process, makes it pretty difficult for us to return children to Central America. That was part of the problem, but President Obama's deferred action on childhood admissions, that's the line of demarcation. That's when those unaccompanied children started flooding into America, because the signal to the rest of the world was, if you can get in here as a minor, you're going to be able to stay. That's an incentive. So the way you solve the problem is eliminate or reduce the incentives for illegal immigration. That's how you really secure the border. We've got to beef up some fencing in some of the areas, have interior enforcement, but the achievable goal in terms of unaccompanied children is we have to stop the flow. We will deal with the kids that are here, and we'll do it compassionately and humanely. But we got to stop the flow, and the best way to stop the flow is we have to deter parents in Central America from making a terrible decision for their children, spending a year's worth of salary, put their children on a journey. Some of them get on top of a train they call the Beast. You realize they give birth control to the young girls because they realize the instance of sexual assault is high. We don't know how many started the journey haven't finished it. So I think it's compassionate to deter parents from not making that terrible decision. The best way to deter them is to literally take their children that are here, return them safely and humanely back to their home country, back to their parents, where they were just a few weeks ago. Okay? That's what I think we have to do. You got to secure the border first. Listen, there are hundreds of millions, if not billions of people that would like to live in America. I agree with them. It's the world's best country, the greatest country in the history of mankind. We just can't accept all of them at once. We need a legal, functioning immigration system. We don't have that. We need to fix that, but you got to first secure the border by limiting those incentives. So that's my take on it. Anybody else? Okay, sure.
I've got a multi-part question. First of all, if we're talking about single parents and we're talking about the kids, what are you proposing doing to lower the number of single parents in the country? Secondly, what are you proposing to do to the food stamp program? And if you're proposing to eliminate it, how do you respond to the Paul Krugmans of the world that essentially say that our statistics are misleading in that we don't account, first of all, for what the drain on society would be if we truly didn't feed these poor kids. And secondly, the statistics don't account for the benefit that society sees from these kids that are fed, that ultimately go on, that become educated, and that become producers for our economy.
Let's, and I'll answer that, but in this kind of circuitous way. The healthcare law, and this is according to CBO, is incentivizing about 2.5 million workers not to offer their work. We've disincentivized people from entering the labor force. And if you've noticed what's happening with unemployment, one of the reasons unemployment rates are actually coming down, we've only just returned to the employment level we had, number of people employed back in November 2007. We just got back to that. The reason the unemployment rate is so low is so many people have left the labor force, they don't have incentive to work. There are other demographic problems facing that as well. So we have to look at the incentive structure we have in terms of people staying single, not marrying the father. We have to look at those incentives, and we've got to change them. But listen, it's going to be very difficult. Weaning yourself off of any addiction is hard. It's extremely hard. But again, listen to that head of the welfare department in Pennsylvania, where the incentives are to stop working at $29,000. Don't do any more work until we change that incentive structure. And it's going to be complicated. You've got to try and incentivize people to keep bettering themselves, and you've got to incentivize people to form those intact families. You certainly don't want to incentivize them to stay unmarried. You want to incentivize people for intact families. I don't have a real good solution for it right now, but we're not even close to the solution phase because we're not honestly looking at the problem. So again, I would, in response to Paul Krugman, is, yeah, you can put all these theories and, yeah, we got to have all this government spending, that's going to improve our economy. But by doing that, your economy grows with two factors: human capital combined with financial capital. When people withdraw their human capital from the economy doesn't grow. It's going to be smaller. And so what we need to incentivize people to be in the economy. And all these transfer payments, it's hard to argue against the fact that they create incentives not to enter the labor force, or certainly not to work as many hours or make as much money, be as productive as you need to be. Again, enormously difficult issues. And again, we're just starting the first step of this thing is let's lay out the problems. And listen, guys, I'm not saying I'm 100% correct. This is my viewpoint on it. But I think we need to have an honest discussion, debate. We need to set aside the demagoguery. Let me just, a real aside, let's talk about how we actually do discuss things politically in this country. Whether you agree or disagree with Paul Ryan's proposal on Medicare. By the way, it's never been scored. Do you realize for Medicare, for every dollar that goes in the system, $3 will be paid out in benefits? Over the next 35 years, our projection shows that Medicare will pay out $35 trillion more in benefits than it takes in the payroll tax. So there's that deficit. Now, Paul Ryan makes a proposal for some income support type of system. It's never been scored. Nobody knows how much that $35 trillion deficit it will solve. What the political debate is over Paul Ryan's is his opponents produce a TV ad of a Paul Ryan lookalike pushing Granny off the cliff. And I guess I would argue until we improve the level, the honesty of our political debate, again, we're not even close to be able to solve these problems. Just kind of keep throwing around the demagoguery, we keep talking past each other. I'm actually trying to define a template, a 30-year. In another talk I gave, which you can get on my website, gave a speech at a Cato event where we really laid out this 30-year deficit. I've got a solutions menu. We're starting to throw in, not necessarily my solutions, I'm not proposing it. I'm just showing the other things that people throw on the table, like adjust age, means test, increase taxes, decrease COLAs, change CPI calculations. And I'm just laying out the scores. Because I hear all the time, well, Social Security, that's easy to fix. Oh, yeah, you try it. So quit getting away with it. Stop with these political bromides, this demagoguery. Start actually looking at the problem honestly. These are financial problems. You got to look at numbers. And trust me, I realize in Washington, people aren't real good with numbers. And people don't like people don't like looking at numbers. And you turn them off really fast. I mean, I get that. There's no way to get somebody to turn off the channel on TV program and start throwing up charts and graphs. I mean, I understand that, but you got to actually deal with numbers on a financial problem. Anybody else? Okay. I really can't see the hands, so just right back here.
Thank you for the presentation, and thank you for bringing some objective data to this conversation. To the gentleman up front's question about deficit reduction, I appreciate that the 3 priorities you laid out are valid responses to that, but yet looking at your own presentation and graphs, the primary driver of the long-term deficit is the mandatory spending, and yet you didn't place those in your top 3 priorities. So I'm wondering if you can explain to us why and what you would do to address those.
Because again, I think that the number one component of the solution is economic growth. Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at how you solve the spending problem, the number one problem is Medicare. President Obama in our dinner with him acknowledged that it's Medicare. And he also behind closed doors was willing to admit it's $1 in, $3 going out, but he kind of leaned over and said most Americans don't understand that. And that's my point. They don't. So yeah, we've got to address Medicare, and that's what President Obama claimed he was doing with Obamacare. It's not going to reduce healthcare spending. It's maybe coercively. It's not going to be improving our healthcare system. And obviously you've got to deal with Social Security. That's on the spending side. But if you can get economic growth, I mean, for example, I don't have the numbers right off the tip of my head, but even with the meager economic growth we've had since 2009 till today, federal revenues increased to more than $600 billion per year from economic growth. So I would really, there's 2 ways of solving this problem, with revenue, through economic growth, or cutting spending. The easier way, the least painful way is let's have a robust economy. By the way, that's also how you raise living standards, livable wages, is get a robust economy so employers are competing for labor rather than have the federal government come in and set wage rates, which actually cost people jobs. And you guys can say, well, it's great, we've gone from 725 to 1010, but 1010 times 0 isn't particularly helpful to people. Anybody else with a question? I guess I've depressed you long enough, huh? Okay, well, thank you very much. Appreciate you putting up with me.